everyone. Welcome to Module 3. I won't spend too much time on this one. Remember, I'm trying to get really succinct with these PowerPoint voiceover PowerPoints. So either way, so today we're going to be talking a little bit about early elements of research design, sampling and qualitative studies, and just different opinions, controversy, similarities, differences across the qualitative methods. I think for the first part, though, we're going to be really focusing on the early elements of research design. And what does that mean? It's basically how to write the research question. So there is a little bit of a process when it comes to research question development. I think you'll find that also in the assignment that's for this particular module. I think you'll start seeing that there was a process, and it goes into a little more detail, in the slide here. But also just remember, think about your assignment. Now remember, this may be a temporary research question. All I want you to really do, you don't have to really give me the most formal, perfect research question. What I want to do is I just want to get an idea of what you're looking at, how you're going to look at it, and then how maybe it would be looked at from a qualitative component. So in general, just a quick review here. So what is a research question? Well, it kind of gives us the plan, right? It's the beginning stages of the plan of what we're going to do, right? What is the do that we're going to do, right? Excuse the phrasing, but the thing is that we're really trying to figure out what's happening with your phenomena of interest, right? Now remember, since this is qualitative stuff, we'll be looking at phenomena in a very different way, right? So remember, there's a couple of ways to look at it. And remember, I think it goes back to that whole intangible kind of descriptive that I've been using in some of these lectures here. But either way, it's the beginning point of the research plan, the research endeavor, right? It should go in tandem with the purpose statement. I know a lot, you've probably seen a few articles now, and probably even had some exercises where sometimes it's a little, where you have to come up with a research question that's a little bit separate from the purpose statement, right? I think in general, what you see even to this day, right? You have the research question, and then you kind of have it's mostly, like in the last sentence of an opening section or the introduction of an article. It says the purpose of this study, so on and so forth. However, though, just to jump back into the qualitative stuff, now remember, there is some kind of fine-tuning of the language when it comes to qualitative stuff and qualitative research question writing. So the thing is that you have to keep in mind the objectives of the study. What is it that you want to do? What is it that you want to be able to examine? And what is it that you want to make sense? Now, the thing is, though, is that we really don't use that terminology, hypotheses, right, when it comes to qualitative work. But I will leave it at that there, because further in other modules we'll discuss kind of like the differences. But yes, I have seen some qualitative studies that do have a hypothesis. So keep that in mind. It's just really about how you word it. But again, let me warn you, that's not really kind of the way that most scholars will recognize the use of a hypothesis. But either way, in some of your readings, you'll probably come across, the word hypotheses a little bit. I think in some of the Creswell reading and some of the supplemental readings, if you had time to look at those supplemental readings, it does talk about qualitative exercise, meaning the qualitative study being a hypothesis generating type of activity. I wouldn't want to call it study, because that's not the way that the readings kind of describe it. But yeah, so it is kind of tied into the hypotheses and what you all, especially for those that are sticking to quantitative stuff or quantitative methods, right, in your own work. Just keep that in mind, that sometimes the language is interchangeable, sometimes it's not. It's just depending on how you use it. And again, there is a central question, right? It should relate to the inquiry. I think this kind of goes back to, when I think back to your introductions, in some of the other in some of the introductory coursework where you're taught about, what is the research question. And also remember too that a lot of research questions may have sub questions as well. We'll get a little bit more into that here in this lecture. So to go into a little more detail, in some of the, in the Creswell book, they talk a little bit about, there is kind of like a script, right? Kind of a format, or a template to write a qualitative research question. I think, in the readings they call it central questions, so don't get thrown off by that. But yeah, it's basically how you write a research question. Now, before I go further, just remember there are certain purposes for certain types of research questions, right? So for example, there's, you have exploratory questions, you have explanatory questions, you have descriptives, and you have predictive. Now the last one, the predictive, I really don't see that too much in qualitative stuff. I mean, there might be, it just depends the way that the study is designed. But just remember that we, that's really, we really don't talk a little bit. We don't really use that predictive kind of modeling, right? It's kind of an extension of, it kind of ties into like, well, what is the purpose of the study, right? But again, that's based on your research question. So I guess just to start from the top again. So remember, it's exploratory, explanatory, and descriptive are the ones that I really want to get at. Now, this particular script that you're seeing on the slide, that kind of talks a little bit about, in general, all these three combined, right? So the purposes of what you're going, the purposes of your study. Now, it just depends, right? There are certain wording, or there's certain wording that will necessitate, the way that you describe a phenomenon and describe how you're going to do something. And it kind of ties into that's, into your selection of the research strategy itself, right? So for example, when you look at an exploratory question, at least from a case, from the qualitative side or perspective, you're looking at, you're investigating little understood phenomena. You're trying to discover important variables. And again, this is where we'll start saying, like, again, this is the, activities to generate hypotheses, right? I think when it comes to exploratory, like I said, it really just depends on how you word it. And remember, these are not exclusive. There might be an overlap. But realistically, when you have maybe an exploratory type of question, you probably looking at doing a case study of some sort. Moving on to the explanatory, explanatory is just kind of trying to make sense of the phenomena, right? And the way that it plays out in that particular context, right? You're trying to figure out all the, I don't want to say variables, but all the actors, right, in this particular context and how they interact with each other, if there is an interaction. But either way, it's kind of like how it affects how all these activities that you may be measuring or looking at, how how the phenomena of interest is affected by those types of activities, right? I think some of those things, explanatory are, figuring out what relationships are, what are some of the actors in the phenomena, right? Like person A interacting with person B. That would be like, how does a clinician interact with a client slash patient, so on and so forth, right? So there are certain ways. There are certain mechanisms that are kind of reserved for that type of investigation. But again, if you see yourself in an explanatory, kind of like trying to explain what's going on in the phenomena, or how is a unit of analysis being affected by X variable or phenomena on the within its context, then you're looking at things like ethnographies. Again, remember I said there's some overlap. You can do case studies. And also you can do some narrative analysis, but it has to be really specific, right? It's like using that narrative data in order to connect it to the process that's being looked at, right? And then lastly, there's the descriptive part, right? And that's just, you're basically getting your phenomena of interest down on paper, right? Or slash on paper, not on paper, but but figuratively, right? You're really just kind of laying down that, that phenomena of interest, kind of identifying, the units that will be analyzed or the units of analysis. Again, other things that can, to descriptive stuff can really be, if your question ties into more descriptive elements, don't be surprised if, you're looking at an ethnography. If you're looking at, a phenomenology, but again, it all varies on how you present that data. But, you know, um, while you may have noticed that I didn't mention, the five qualitative designs, in all these are just more the way I'm just trying to give example of, how a research question, purpose of study kind of interact within, the development of qualitative work. Again, I think this slide is pretty clear, right? There are certain things. So, what is it? The how or what is the, and then it just depends, right? Meaning of for phenomenology, story of or for the narrative, narrative research, grounded theory, ethnography is the cultural patterns, right? And not only that, remember the unit of analysis, right? Or the case, right? For a case study, and so forth. So in this particular slide, you see that, there are some criteria for deciding which qualitative approach you want to use, right? Again, it ties back to your research question. Then you got to kind of figure out, okay, what is it that the question is asking for? Remember, I talked a little bit about the exploratory, the explanatory, the descriptive, right? You can kind of see that then if it's exploratory in nature, then you have certain, designs that you can use, right? But overall, when it talks a little bit about qualitative approaches, the explanatory, again, like I said, ethnography tends to be really useful when it comes to when you're trying to just explore what's going on within a phenomena, right? I think case studies are useful as well. Undeveloped phenomena, again, this is where we're starting to look at, more like grounded theory, right? Because it's not really developed. We don't really have a starting point, right? Or we really don't have a robust state of science, right, within that particular phenomena. It's pretty, I think this is just kind of in general, like in all, I think narrative analysis is pretty useful for the next one, right? When data is auditory or visual, cannot put that really down into a quantitative component, right? I mean, you just can't really, to describe what you hear or to describe what you're seeing. Again, that's kind of like that really is kind of reserved for more qualitative stuff. But either way, I think this one, when data is auditory or visual, you have you have some, some designs, right? So like I said, narrative, right? They describe, they're trying to bring to light, right? Well, what is being investigated. A lot of times you can if it's cultural, right? So let's say there's like a song, or maybe there's a specific visual element to your phenomena, you would use an ethnographic approach. Um, I think, depending phenomenology really, it can be used. And again, it goes to any of these five designs that we're focusing on this semester. They can all kind of be used for any of this stuff, but you got to be very clear on what you're looking at and how you're going to look at it. Again, I think the cultural phenomena, again, I think I don't mean to be repetitive, but again, cultural usually means ethnography. Again, if you're looking for a theoretical foundation, right? And it has to do a little bit with some culture or with cultural phenomena. I wouldn't be surprised if you said, what, a grounded theory approach is pretty useful for this. Overlapping processes, right? Basically how one may affect the other, right? Maybe there's two simultaneous processes. I think one thing that we're seeing a lot right now, especially in this day and age, right, when we talk a little bit about intersectionality, right? For those of you that are familiar with that particular concept, you can see that it's, the measuring of these overlapping processes. When it comes to intersectionality, it's usually reserved for, um, describing or examining, sources and experiences of marginalization. So, for example, when a male is going to experience something different as compared to a self-identified woman, right? So I'll take in case, like, let's say two people, one male, one female, are doing the exact same job, but the woman gets paid less, right? Would be one example, right, of marginalization for doing the exact amount of work, right? So there's already a disparity. But then when you add maybe a racial component to it, right, a black woman may experience marginalization different than, let's say, a Hispanic male. But do you see how it's like just it's overlapping processes, right? You have that racialized component, you have that economic marginalization, you have that simultaneously going on with the whole gender marginalization. And then also, just lastly, I think, and this is for probably reserved for phenomenology, but don't be surprised. I mean, it's just the way you word it, so I wouldn't be surprised if there are other designs. But if you're trying to make meaning of an experience, that just kind of rings phenomenology.